This video is sponsored by the Ides of March. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another episode of the Best Armies in Warhammer 40k, the weekly video series where we go through undefeated results from the past week of competitive play and talk about what's currently winning. This being Christmas weekend, for all you people who are into that sort of thing, this means that we are a little starved for competitive results this week, but I did delve a little deep into the repository of competitive results in order to give us a little bit more to talk about. In this case, we're going to be looking at three events in particular: the 24 Horas GTS Granada, the Second City Games GT, as well as the Warhammer 40k Galaversity. Now, we had strong results from a lot of the top meta contenders right now. Chaos Daemons and Salamanders, both topping the GTS Granada. Now, those were X and 1 results. That event was actually only 10 players, but it did go the full 5 rounds, but I wanted to talk about the top placing lists regardless. So Chaos Demons with Scintillating Legion doing well at that one, but also interesting to see some Forge Father Seeker Salamanders with some very unique units in it, which I'm excited to discuss. 5-0 results from Tau Empire at the Second City Games GT, and the 40k Galaversity ending with a draw. It was a larger event, so it was a natural draw, but it was using differential scoring, so it wasn't draw in terms of the actual VP scores, but in terms of the differential scores. That was between Ultramarines and, interestingly, Aeldari, coming out of the woodwork even after all of their massive nerfs that they received on the last data slate update. Now, let's dive into those lists just after a word from our sponsor. This video is sponsored by the Ides of March, which, in addition to being a date, is also the date for a Warhammer 40k and AOS GT. Ides of March is a multi-game event held every year in Central March at the gorgeous Samoset Resort in Rockport, Maine. This event venue features stunning views and an absolutely incredible locale, and you can enjoy those views while playing Warhammer 40k. The event will feature not only a 100-player Warhammer 40k Major, but also a similar-sized event for Age of Sigmar, as well as events for Blood Bowl and Star Wars Shatterpoint. Not to mention, it's also featuring a painting competition for those who are more hobby inclined. I'll be there live streaming the event, so I'll see you there as well, as long as you head down to the links in the video description or hit the QR code on screen to get your tickets to the Ides of March today. And I'll see you there March 13th through 15th, 2026. So starting with the 40k Galaversity, Richard Ivani went undefeated, 5-0-1 at that event with an Eldar Aspect Host. For those who don't know, Aspect Host got ruinously nerfed in the last update. A lot of its most common units were massively upcharged. Its most common combo, the ability to put units back into a transport using Skyborn Sanctuary at the end of the fight phase, was also nerfed. You now must have fought in the fight phase or been eligible to fight in order to do so, so it really only works on units engaging in melee. And the transport mechanics themselves have also been changed because of the nerfs to star engines, which restricted the movement of those transports with their ability to move quickly and disembark units. So you can no longer move the transports fast to get additional threat range. You can now no longer disembark and then re-embark into the transport, and the units that you were doing that with are now also more expensive. So the old triple hammer nerf to these styles of lists from Games Workshop, a characteristic overcorrection, I think, from the Games Workshop development team. However, it seems like Eldar are finding a way around these debuffs. And in this case, it is actually by reorienting the play of the detachment from playing a lot of these transport-focused light infantry squads into bikers and more deep strike mechanics. So in this case, we're bringing Behareth as well as Janzar and Lycus. We have a unit of Corsair Void Reavers in the battle line to act as objective holders. We have 2 backline units of Dark Reapers. Those guys both with Tempest launchers, so we have a little bit of anti-light infantry indirect fire. However, we're also then bringing the direct fire shooting. The big thing there, obviously, is that I think a lot of armies are preparing for a lot of deep strike oriented armies. There's definitely play with factions like Deathwatch and Chaos Demons that are doing really well. So players are taking light screening units in order to block those out, and we're able to deal with those Tempest launchers, at least to some extent. We then have 2 units of Rangers in order to score, 2 units of Howling Banshees for aggressive melee, plus 3 units of Shining Spears. Now, this is really interesting. Not a unit that was taken super highly previously, but they do have solid maneuverability. They're able to sort of supplement the army's mobility by pushing forward really quickly, and they are good into a wide variety of profiles. They don't really care about any Aspect Shrine token nerfs because they don't have any attached characters that ever use Aspect Shrine tokens. And they give you a capacity to hit basically anything in the game, represent a lot of damage into it, and threaten long threat ranges without having to worry about any of these infantry nerfs that we saw from the update. So 3 total units of 3 Shining Spears. We're then focusing very heavily on Swooping Hawks as well. That's going to be 2 units of 10 Swooping Hawks. One of those is going to get Behareth as well, plus another unit of 5. That's being backed up by 1 Warp Spider unit for Lycus, plus 2 Warwalkers. So the nice thing we can do here is we can gain a AP characteristic from the Warwalkers. We can then shoot Lycus at a target to get 5+ critical hits, and then we can blast it with Swooping Hawks. So all those Swooping Hawks are going to be coming in at AP 1. All of those with lethal hits, rerolling ones, critical 5 up in the lethal hit, and we could even pay to give them sustained hits as well if we're shooting into something that they can maybe reasonably wound with their normal attacks. So these units that are firing 40-ish shots plus dealing 5 or so mortal wounds after they run in with their grenade ability and the ability to throw grenades naturally as well, makes them incredibly high damage. Now, they are relatively expensive for an easy-to-kill unit. However, if you are engaging with your Warwalkers, plus all the Swooping Hawks, plus all of the Shining Spears, that it oftentimes is enough individual activations that your opponent isn't going to be able to easily deal with all of them at once. And so you're able to pull so much damage into them, survive for a little bit, sort of take the board, and then do the same thing on a subsequent turn or with the second wave of attackers, that you're going to be able to sustain the damage out, even without the use of any of the really powerful bricks that this detachment used to rely on, which were things like the Asherman, Dire Avengers, and a Falcon combo to give him devastating wounds, rerolls, Aspect Shrine tokens to generate a lot of mortal wounds, or things like the Fuegan brick that used to use Fuegan plus 10 fire dragons to use Skyborn Sanctuary in and out of transports. Those are all no longer that useful because Asherman can't use the Aspect Shrine tokens. Obviously, Fuegan can no longer Skyborn Sanctuary unless he charges, which is a little bit tough to do coming out of a transport. So those units have been nerfed. We're going to be reorienting into the already played units like Swooping Hawks and like these Shining Spears. I think that's an interesting direction for the faction. It will be interesting to see if it continues to be as consistent moving on into the future. There's certainly some bad matchups and inefficiencies for the styles of Eldar armies. However, I would love to see it if Eldar continued to remain a viable competitive option even past all of these nerfs, because I think right now the narrative is definitely that the nerfs were maybe heavy-handed and that the faction was really struggling, although Richard over here is certainly proving us wrong with his excellent result. Now, moving on to the second place placer in this same event, we have Daniel Orosh, who went undefeated 5-0-1 with that tie in the finals against Richard to take second place at the event. He was running an Ultramarines Gladius task force. I know a lot of people were wondering where Ultramarines were going to end up, and here they are at the top of the list using the newly nerfed Victrix Honor Guard. We have been seeing Ultramarines doing incredibly well since even post the change to Victrix Honor Guard in the last data slate update. However, they haven't necessarily won or gone undefeated as many times as maybe we would expect for the amount of coverage that the faction gets. And we'll see if that may be changing here, but at the very least, they did take second place at this event with an undefeated record. Now, in this case, we see some familiar faces. We have Captain Sicarius, that's the original Cato Sicarius version, who grants his unit Assault and Scout. We have a Captain in Gravis armor with Artificer armor, so that's to give him a 2+ armor save and a 5+ invulnerable save, comboed with his ability to use stratagems for free, so he can do things like use Armor of Contempt or reactive moves for 0 CP once per battle round. Keeps him alive quite a bit in addition to his half damage ability. It's been a while since we've seen that guy, but he has still unchanged with his absolutely incredible resilience. We have a Combi Weapon Lieutenant, so we have another potentially reactive moving independent character, that guy with Lone Operative, obviously. And both these units are able to supplement the army with their capacity to score secondaries really consistently and actually survive for a couple turns in order to continue to do that. Plus, last as the Warlord, we have Marnius Calgar to lead a Victrix Honor Guard squad and generate us some command points. We have an Intercessor squad for the backline, one Impulsor that typically gets embarked into by a Victrix Honor Guard unit with the Captain Sicarius. Sicarius grants his unit Scout as long as you embark the entire Scout unit into a dedicated transport that doesn't have any non-scouting models in it. This transport will also gain Scout, so you're then able to move that Impulsor 6 inches up. You're then threatening a reactive move from Captain Sicarius, so we have potentially 3 reactive moves available between all 3 of these characters. We have a Squad Tactics open, plus the reactive move from the Combi Weapon Lieutenant, plus the reactive move from the Sicarius unit. That is important to note, measured from Sicarius himself, They actually changed that ability on his new Kato Sicarius datasheet where it grants the unit a reactive move. But for some reason, the Captain Sicarius version reactive moves only if you move within 9 inches of him. So it is a little bit easier to play around in some instances. But if you don't, it ends up allowing him to run back into his transport after he engages into something. So you have this unit that could potentially scout up the board. You can then give it advanced charge, you can move it up aggressively and start to clear units, and then threaten, if your opponent comes in at all, the ability to run them back into that vehicle if they allow you to, and protect themselves for another turn. We then have another unit of Victrix Honor Guard with Marneus Calgar. Interestingly, the way that this list is actually designed is that it splits the Epic Hero unit attachments for the Victrix Honor Guard between the two Honor Guard units. So one of them is running the Blades of Honor, the Chapter Champion, the twin-linked guy, and the other one is running the Ancient. I imagine that's so we can run the Ancient in the unit that is not attaching to Marneus Calgar, and then the champion inside the Marneus Calgar unit to give it as many twin-linked attacks as possible, because the twin-linked attacks don't necessarily need Honor the Chapter or +1 to Wound as often. So we can utilize the higher volume, lower impact attacks from the Ancient equipped unit to gain that damage bonus from Lance, +1 to Wound and +1 AP in Assault Doctrine, and then rely on the Ancient plus an attached character to do all the damage on the second unit. So if you ever have to engage with both units at the same time, you can spread the damage out between them rather than having one unit that's going to be getting all of the increased damage value. You don't really need the inclusion of the champion plus the ancient together if we are expecting to use Honor the Chapter on one of those units, and then rely on like Marneus Calgar, for example, as the heavy damage output of the second unit. Interesting unit composition to talk about there. From there, the list is focused very heavily on vehicles. We do have an Incursor squad for utility, plus the Intercessor squad I mentioned earlier. We're going to be focusing a lot on the characters to get a lot of the utility done, but we also have a Redemptor Dreadnought for some early game defensive technology, plus a pair of Vindicators and a pair of Predator Annihilators. With the +1 to Wound from Oath of Moment, these guys can deal an incredible amount of damage at range. The Annihilators have a relatively high volume of AP3 D6 plus X damage shooting between the Hunter Killer Missile and the 3 las cannons, the twin-link las cannon on the top and the 2 sponson-mounted las cannons. So you can hopefully clear a unit with your ranged attacks with Oath of Moment to benefit them. The Incursor squad can help you allow that Oath of Moment to travel a little bit farther because you can Incursor another unit to get the rest of your guns to hit on 2s. So we can pull one down with the Annihilators and the Redemptor Dreadnought with Oath of Moment. We can shoot a second unit for the Vindicators to deal with. And then at the same time, the Victrix Honor Guard don't necessarily need Oath of Moment because they have a base 2+ weapon scale. Obviously, they would prefer to get that +1 to Wound, but we can source the +1 to Wound from Honor the Chapter. So we can basically target down 3 to 4 individual units without needing more than one Oath of Moment target. We're trying to stretch that Oath of Moment for as long as possible between these support elements, which I think makes a lot of sense in an army that's focused on Victrix Honor Guard that doesn't have Rabuta Gilliman. The Honor Guard are relatively self-sufficient, and we have enough shooting support for the ranged attacks that we can play outside of that. The other thing, too, is that we are in Gladius Task Force, so we do have some good defensive technology in a fight on death for the Victrix Honor Guard. However, we are missing that -1 to Wound for the vehicles, so important to note that we don't have that. If these vehicles end up in a shooting war against an opposing gun line, they are a little bit easier to kill in this detachment than they would be in Blades of Ultramar. However, you do get the benefit of stronger melee infantry. Now with that, we're going to move on to the Second City Games GT. This was a smaller event, 28 players versus the Galaversaries 32. This one ended up being won by Tau Empire. John Kilcommons taking this down with a Mont Cod detachment. That's the early game focus detachment that grants assault to ranged weapons in the early game and lethal hits when you target a spotted unit. This is being led by an Ethereal with coordinated exploitation. So that enhancement while he's leading a unit, and there is a strike team that with a Guardian drone that's going to be a bunker for him. So a little -1 to be wounded, the unit that he can hop into. The nice thing about the strike team as well is that they gain the marker light keyword just having it innately. Previously it was because you could take marker lights equipped to the pulse rifles of the chassis in the unit, but now they just have it sort of built in, which allows his unit to spot and then grant marker light bonuses, then also sustained 1 and lethal when you are guiding another unit. From there, we also have a breacher team and a devilfish, so we get a good offensive unit that we can have that devilfish run out. We have an auto 6 advanced stratagem in the detachment, and then you can, because devilfish have assault transport, they can then disembark their embarked unit after advancing, so you get this is one Devilfish that can push really, really far up and put OC2 high output breachers onto an enemy objective or somewhere important from the early game. We have a second Devilfish, and there are two Pathfinder teams. One of them has a grav inhibitor drone, so they're going to be hopping into the second Devilfish. The other one has a recon drone, so they're going to get infiltrators to deploy up in the front center of the battlefield. So we have one infiltrate plus scout Pathfinder team. The other one is going to be scouting up a transport, and then we have a second transport that can hide behind that with the breachers to sort of plug any gaps that we end up with. We then have a trio of hammerhead gunships. In this case, one of them was equipped with a railgun. The other two were equipped with ion cannons. The ion cannons get a huge boost from lethal hits here. Since targeting large, high toughness vehicles, the ion cannons at only strength 8 tend to founder. However, the lethal hits is in many cases like a very equivalent to almost a +1 to wound. The railgun is better for late game use because you don't necessarily need the lethal hits to get damage from it. So once the lethal hits expires and battle rounds 3 onward, it's going to be able to do some serious damage. In addition to that, it can combat with coordinated exploitation. If you do roll a 6 on the railgun shot, it does double damage. If you shoot something that the strike team is observing, we have a Ghost Keel battlesuit to help hold side objectives and kind of toilet bowl the game in the midboard, plus a pair of piranhas for some additional early game aggression. So we do have the capacity to basically force down 2 Devilfish worth of infantry, plus a pair of piranhas that can both scout or auto 6 advance and then deploy units. So we could deal serious damage to enemies that don't set up to absorb the charge in the top of turn 1 here. We then have 2 Riptide battlesuits with ion accelerators, plus a pair of stealth battlesuit teams for some additional spotting, plus a Vespid Stingwing unit for utility. Altogether, relatively standard stuff for Mod Cop, but it is cool to see that Ethereal in there attached to a strike team. That's not a combination we typically see. It's a very expensive enhancement to give him that sustained hits bonus, but it does make sense if you are firing as high a volume of shooting at this list as this list can put out. All of those Pathfinder teams are able to fire their multi-shot ion rifles with lethal hit plus sustained. We have the ion cannons from the hammerhead gunships and even the ion accelerators from the Riptide battlesuits. So we're able to get a lot of use out of those the sustained hits. The breacher team as well really likes to have sustained hits because it will typically be getting wound rerolls. So it's actually very high impact shooting. It doesn't benefit from the lethal hits from the detachment ability quite as much. So if we could give it sustains, it ends up doing quite a bit more damage. Now, from there, we're going to move on to our final event of the weekend. This is the 24 Horas GTS Granada. This was an Iron Man style of event, so that means that it ran all 5 rounds in a single day. So these events tend to incentivize particularly straightforward lists, because once you're playing 5 games of 40k a day, you're probably playing 40k for 15 or 16 straight hours. By round 3 or round 4, you tend to get kind of burnt out. And if your list is too complicated or too difficult to resolve, it can get pretty tough. So it's always interesting to take a peek at what succeeds in these, because it tends to be kind of like skewier, tankier stuff. I will mention that this event was much smaller than the events we typically cover. It was only 10 players, and it actually didn't come down to a single undefeated. There were 2 X1s that went down to tiebreakers for the ultimate result. But I do want to talk about both of them because I think it's really interesting to discuss what is winning these styles of events. Now, the first one is Kameni Rodriguez, who actually won the event with a Forge Father Seekers Salamanders list. Now, I'm interested to talk about this because probably by the time you're watching this, within 24 to 48 hours, there will be a how to get started in Salamanders video out. I'm going to have videos both discussing a build guide for Salamanders that will be available on the channel, as well as a channel membership that will talk about a more sophisticated variety of Forge Father Seekers. So it's basically going to be a Salamander-filled week on TacticalTortoise, because I'm going to have at least 2 additional videos out talking explicitly about Salamanders. And it's cool that they also won an event. This was X and 1, but Kameni did end up winning this tournament. In this case, there are some really interesting decisions being made in this list as well. We were running Adrax Agatone as well as Vulcan Heston, the Salamander special characters. On top of that, a combi weapon lieutenant and a jump pack captain equipped with a hand flamer. Now, interestingly, the jump pack captain actually did not have any enhancements attached to him. Usually you see this guy with Immolator, and we'll talk about the reason for that in a moment. From there, we have a trio of Impulsors. Those guys are going to be carrying around either Blade Guard veterans to go with Adrax Agatone, or Infernus Marine squads. So we do have a 6 model Blade Guard veteran unit that's to attach in with Adrax. Adrax gives them full wound rerolls, and the Blade Guard veteran naturally reroll their ones to hit. You have a 1 CP stratagem, Crucible Battle, to get +1 to wound in melee. So the unit actually just deals kind of a phenomenal amount of damage in melee without the use of Oath of Moment. You have essentially 3 potential activations, and this is what a lot of Space Marine armies come down to. We've talked about this with Ultramarines as well. Between the Vulcan Heston unit, so Vulcan can choose an enemy, and you get wound rerolls against that with Melta and Flame weapons. We then can engage a unit with Adrex Hegatone and use Crucible of Battle. That's going to get +1 to wound and basically be self-sufficient, and then we get actual Oath of Moment on a 3rd unit. So you can essentially choose 3 units and almost certainly remove them with whatever shooting you have available. With all that in mind, I think it's also important to note that we do have Iron Hail Sky Talon arrays on all of the impulsors. That's incredibly important in this case because Forge Father Seekers has the same detachment rule as a Firestorm Assault Force. So these guys, once they get within 12 inches of their target, which they usually want to be, they're going to be firing 22 Strength 5 ranged attacks. So if we're shooting at opposing toughness 4 bricks, so other Space Marine armies, for example, you're going to be wounding on 2s if you Oath of Moment them and full hit rerolls. So each of these impulsors is averaging somewhere around 18 or so wounds against T4 enemies that you can Oath of Moment. Obviously, that number goes down a little bit if you are firing at something with like a -1 to wound effect, like Victor's Honor Guard, but you can imagine that with their powers combined, 3 impulsors dumping damage into a single target with Oath of Moment actually do appreciable damage with only their light shooting. We get 6 shots off of a Iron Hail Heavy Stubber, we get 8 shots off of a Stormbolter, and then we get 8 additional sustained hits shots off of the Sky Talon array that sometimes get a bonus against flying units, which is cool. And then on top of that, they have firing deck, so we can do things like fire Blade Guard veterans with their pistols. Adrax has a D6 plus 3-shot flamer. We can fire Inferno squads or even Vulcan's unit out of the top of those if they are embarked, which can also add up some significant damage on top of that. So these little flavor boats are incredibly powerful. We have a company hero squad that's to attach to Vulcan Heston to keep him alive for longer. What we want to do is get as many activations out of Vulcan's ability as possible. And Firestorm Assault Force, this gets done by using Rapid Embarkation to return him into transports at the end of the turn. As long as you didn't start the turn inside a transport, then he can embark at the end of the turn for a command point. However, we don't have that in Forge Father Seekers, so the company heroes with -1 to wound and 1,000,000 wounds can usually keep him alive for 1 more turn. We then have Gladiator Valiant, which is interesting, but it's an additional caddy for some high-impact multi-meltas, which are obviously very beneficial to the detachment as a whole. We have a Scout Squad for some early game utility, a Stormspeeder Hail Strike, which is interesting. That gives +1 AP against infantry units that it shoots at. A nice thing here is that this guy is running a pair of Fragstorm grenade launchers plus a twin-linked heavy stubber plus an Onslaught Gatling cannon. They get similar output to the Impulsor that we were discussing earlier, where it's just shooting a bunch of attacks with +1 to +1 strength, which can affect it in a lot of matchups against profile matchups against opposing infantry. But the other thing is that it's then going to give +1 AP to the actual impulsors themselves. So you could now be firing these 22 attacks that go to AP1, and things like your Infernus Marines go to AP2 ignore cover, which is extremely consistent. We then have a Stormspeeder Thunder Strike, so we can get +1 to wound against vehicles. So we have another activation to get a similar damage spike into a second unit. And then the pièce de résistance here is a trio of Vanguard veteran squads. One of them is only 5 models. That's equipped with a combination of Hand Flamers and Inferno Pistols. It's Inferno Pistols on the regular Vanguard veterans, a Flamer on the Sergeant. We then have 2 additional 10-man squads. One of them is equipped with a Hand Flamer on the Sergeant plus Inferno Pistols on all 9 Vanguard veterans. The other one is 10 Hand Flamers. Now, typically, what we'll see is the Captain attach into the Hand Flamer unit. You can then get wound rerolls from Vulcan Heston and then use Immolation Protocols for devastating wounds, discounting it from 2 CP down to 1 CP. So you can either run this unit up or Rapid Ingress hit or Deep Strike it normally onto a big single target. Vulcan Heston runs himself out in the middle, protected by his company heroes. You then will be forcing 11d6 full reroll devastating auto hits into the target. And in this case, it probably averages somewhere around, I think, probably 12-ish mortal wounds, I think, is about the average. What's interesting is that we're not running Immolator here, so we don't have +11 attacks on that like we would typically from this combo. But I guess those additional points that would be that enhancement ended up upgrading some other units into stronger support elements. So things like the Inferno Pistol Vanguard Veteran Squad might have been a less useful utility unit previously. It's definitely it could be the case that we just didn't want to all in on that one particular combo. But with Immolator, the whole combo does an incredible amount of damage. It's something like 15 mortal wounds is the average. Now, on top of that, we also then have the Inferno Pistol Squad. These guys can benefit from all of the other buffs that we're looking at. So things like +1 AP from the Hailstrike against infantry enemies, +1 to wound from the Thunderstrike, or just shooting the Oath of Moment target, because the Flamer Vanguard veterans actually activate totally independently of Oath of Moment. All they really need is Vulcan Heston to deal some serious hurt onto something. The Inferno Pistols, being Melta weapons, also get the benefit of Vulcan Heston, so he can buff either them or the Hand Flamers, or both if they're shooting one target at the same time. But I think generally this is going to work a lot like a Shadowmark Talon list, where it's going to try to sequence these units in one at a time. And being able to fire 9 Inferno Pistol shots with potentially +1 at wound plus full wound rerolls allows you, if you're able to use the assault that the detachment gives out of your weapons to get them into Melta range, it allows you to put a serious amount of damage through, and especially into like high armor save, low and vulnerable save units, things like Victrix Honor Guard that we keep talking about, that you can get the buff from the Hail Strikes on. These Inferno Pistols can actually get to pretty high AP values, and they can punch directly through enemies with -1 to be wounded, and essentially almost auto-kill whatever they're shooting at, which gets pretty scary. So we have 2 separate 10 models Vanguard Veteran Squads that can use the benefit of Assault, they can use the +1 strength you get from the detachment, and they have great combinations with any of the Storm Speeders and with Vulcan Heston to do some absolutely incredible damage. I absolutely love the Vanguard veterans in this detachment. They're really the difference maker between this and Firestorm Assault Force. It's definitely a crapshoot which one you play. Firestorm Assault Force is maybe a little bit more consistent. It has a better melee brick because you can take Champion of Humanity on a Lieutenant, and it has better play with transports. However, this detachment makes those Vanguard veteran units sing. And if they ever engage but don't kill their target, they do have a fallback and shoot strat as well. So they can actually continue to be mobile while continuing to deal this incredible pistol damage. And their melee is certainly not something to slouch at. It's not amazing. It is only AP 1 damage. However, after you've already blasted into your opponent with enormous amounts of flamer shooting or Melta shooting, you're probably at a point that a bunch of AP 1 damage, potentially lethal hit attacks are actually going to take you down. Now, with that, we have the second place placer in this same event, also a similar record, 4-1, and it is a detachment that has been getting a lot of discussion over the last couple of weeks. Zandra Ramos running Scintillating Legion Chaos Demons, obviously since the changes to Lords of Change to give them flat 3 damage on their ranged attacks, they are seeing a lot of play, and this is probably one of the most, if not the most competitive army archetype in 40k right now. In this case, we're running a pair of Flux Masters. We do have 2 pink horror units, so we can attach the Flux Masters into them. The benefit there is that the Flux Masters give them -1 to be hit, which really skews a lot of the direct attacks trying to engage with these guys. You then have the 4+ invulnerable save on a massive brick of idiots. The pink horrors they're only 10 wounds baseline, but if you don't one-shot them, then they start splitting and they generate basically a 1-for-1 per casualty into blue horrors, which then can split into 50% brimstone horrors. You end up with something close to 30 or 40 wounds to actually chew through in this unit, and all of that gets -1 to be hit. You could even use flux tokens in some cases to try to keep the last model in the unit alive, so continue to roll splits. It's just an absolutely insanely difficult unit to kill. And the Flux Masters push it even farther. And then with the ability to essentially screen and play aggressively, be relatively confident that your opponent isn't going to kill it without dramatic overextension. You can also use the uppy downy strat, the reposition strat in the detachment to pull them out of melee and then redeploy them elsewhere, so they don't even get stuck into melee very often. We then have Kairos Fateweaver to generate some command points and CP tax our opponents. We have 2 Lords of Change, one of them with Infernal Puppeteer, the detachment to shoot through other units. The other benefit here of the pink horrors is that gives you a huge unit to use Infernal Puppeteer to target through. We have another Lord of Change, and this is, I really love this, because this is not a combination that we typically see, but another Lord of Change with the Neverblade enhancement. In this case, we were not running a Rod of Sorcery on this guy, which is basically the auto-include in almost every single Lord of Change build. However, we are running the Baleful Sword. Now, Neverblade gives you +2 strength, +1 attack, which will only improve the Staff of Tzeentch, to be clear. The sword doesn't get the +1 attack because it's an extra attack weapon, and +1 AP. In addition, it also gives you +1 to hit. So the Lord of Change goes from hitting on 3s, which is a big downside for his inconsistent melee attacks, to hitting on 2s. Now that gives him a Strength 8, AP 2, 3 damage staff with 6 total attacks, plus a Strength 9, AP 3, 3 damage sword. So we're attacking a total of 9, 3, 3 damage melee attacks at relatively high strength and AP values. Now, the big downsides of Lords of Change is that once they get engaged by stuff, they actually don't peel themselves out very well. So sometimes you have to either consider between, do I stay in melee here when I get engaged and give myself -1 to hit, restrict my ability to target units because I can't move to get line of sight, or do I pull him out of melee and then potentially ruin his ability to shoot because you have to redeploy 9 inches away from enemies with Delirium unmade and then try to get shots with an 18-inch range weapon that might be screened out. I don't know. So once they get engaged, the Lord of Change gets really weird. However, the Neverblade Lord of Change might simply just kill whatever engages it. If you run in, let's say 5 Assault Intercessors or something, there's a very reasonable chance he simply kills them and then doesn't have to worry about that anymore. So really cool to see sort of a late game, like melee style Lord of Change. Not a thing we typically see. Last, but certainly not least, in the character slot here, we have a blue Scribes unit as well. Now, on top of that, we have a blue Horror unit to go with the pink Horrors. These guys have Infiltrate, so they're able to run up in the middle of the table and act as a utility unit early. And then the rest of the list is focused very, very heavily on just tanky infantry. We have, or beast in infantry, I guess. We have a Flamer unit, a 3-man Flamer unit that can be a nice utility squad. They're really difficult to screen because there are only 3 of them and they can deep strike in to do stuff. And then we have 18 Screamers, the maximum field allowance of Screamers. These guys are difficult to one-shot. They're large units, which is good for Infernal Puppeteer to get line of sight to things and for running out and stringing back into line of sight blockers in order to get early game secondaries. But also towards the late game, they're very difficult to remove. You're trying to chew through 18 wounds with a 4+ invulnerable save. And then on top of that, they also hit pretty hard in melee too. So we actually can, between them and the Neverblade guy, we don't have a Demon Prince. We don't have any of the other strong melee units available to this detachment, but the Screamers themselves are going to be able to do some serious damage, especially if you've already tuned up your opponent with things like the Infernal Puppeteer shooting at them early game. Kind of an interesting build out of Scintillating Legion. Only 2 Lords of Change plus Kairos. However, we have a massive brick of pink Horrors plus Screamers that can hold down the mid board, and then that Neverblade Lord of Change is always fun to see. So despite the fact that it is probably going to be a very common list archetype moving on into the future, there is definitely some interesting idiosyncrasies in this particular build. But with that, those are all the best armies of Warhammer 40k for this week. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks to everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. I did just upload a Patreon video that's also available for YouTube channel members who can join in the link down below the video. That's talking about a biker-focused version of Wrath of the Rock Dark Angels to go with my recent Dark Angels video that I released. And obviously, I will be talking about my builds for Demons and for Salamanders momentarily here as I continue to list craft and get test games in with the format of this new data slate. So thanks to everybody who supports over there and gets access to that content. Thanks as well to the Ides of March for sponsoring this video. Please check them out in the video description to get your tickets today, and I'll see you over there. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.